Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. They say love makes you do crazy things, but sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes love makes you do the most rational thing possible, even when everyone around you thinks you've lost your mind. My name is Brandon, and many years ago, I thought I had found the one. Lydia was everything I'd been looking for. Intelligent, funny, gorgeous, and we clicked right away. I can't remember exactly when this began, but I know that we were dating when she started mentioning this guy she'd met at her gym. At first, it seemed innocent enough. His name was Danny, and according to Lydia, he was new to the city and had helped her with something that I also can't recall. I didn't think much of it initially. When Danny's name started coming up, I figured he was just another gym acquaintance. But as time went by, Danny's name started coming up more often. A lot more often. It started small. Lydia would mention that Danny had recommended a new restaurant we should try, or that Danny had told her about this hiking trail outside the city that was supposed to have amazing views. Danny had shown her this new exercise for her shoulders. Danny had said something funny about the gym's new policy about wiping down equipment. I started keeping track, not intentionally at first, but I couldn't help noticing. Danny's name was coming up too, maybe 3 times a week in our conversations. For someone who was supposed to be just a casual gym friend, he was occupying a surprising amount of mental real estate in my girlfriend's life. The breaking point came during dinner at this Italian place we both loved. We'd been there maybe 20 minutes, and Lydia had already brought up Danny 4 times. I put down my fork and decided to address it directly. I told Lydia that I was feeling uncomfortable with how often Danny came up in our conversations. I explained that it felt like this guy was becoming a pretty significant presence in her life, and I wasn't sure I was okay with that. Her reaction was immediate and dismissive. She laughed and made it clear she thought I was being ridiculous. She told me I was being silly, that Danny was just a friend, and that I was overthinking the whole thing. She went back to scrolling through her phone while she talked, like the conversation wasn't worth her full attention. I tried to explain that it wasn't about jealousy exactly, but about respect and boundaries in our relationship. I told her that when your partner expresses discomfort about something, maybe the response shouldn't be to laugh it off. She looked up from her phone for about 30 seconds, gave me this patronizing smile, and said I was being insecure. Then she changed the subject to something else she was dealing with, and I let her. That was my first mistake. Over the next few months, Danny's presence in Lydia's life only grew. He lived closer to her, and I live about 35 minutes away. I figured she doesn't mention her as much as she does, but they texted occasionally. After dating for years, I decided to put a ring on her finger. Maybe that would make her create the needed distance between her and male friends like Danny. I got a ring, and with the help of my girlfriend's friends, we organized a surprise for her. She got the ring and said yes to me. Days later, we were spending time quietly at my place. I told her that now we are about to get married, and I hope she has finally drawn a line between her and the guys in her life. She laughed and said she has no business with those guys. I mentioned Danny specifically. She said Danny was having a hard time with his recent breakup and needed someone to vent to. That's the only thing making her give him audience. I told her to advise Danny to get a therapist. She laughed and asked me to stop being jealous. I didn't push further than this. But the most frustrating part was how Lydia continued to treat my concerns like they were completely unreasonable. As we kept planning our wedding, I could see exactly what was happening, but I felt powerless to stop it. Lydia was developing what was essentially an emotional relationship with another man, and every time I tried to address it, I was made to feel like the problem was my insecurity rather than her behavior. Then one Saturday in early October, we had just agreed on a wedding date and were making a list of businesses that would handle the day's operations. Lydia and I were having one of those perfect lazy weekends. We'd ordered fast food from our usual spot on 5th Street, and we were sprawled across her couch watching some action movie I'd already seen twice, but didn't mind seeing again. It was around 2:15 in the afternoon when she got up to use the bathroom. I was reaching for another spring roll when I heard the knock. I paused the movie and walked to the door, figuring it was probably her neighbor, Betty, asking to borrow something again. Lydia's apartment was on the third floor of this converted brownstone, and Betty was always running out of basic things. I opened the door, and there he was. Danny. I recognized him immediately, even though we'd never officially met. He was holding a small potted plant, something with broad green leaves. The shock on his face was immediate and obvious. His eyes went wide, and I watched him process who I was. There was this moment of recognition where I could see him connecting the dots. He recovered quickly. I'll give him that. He straightened up and gave me this friendly but nervous smile. His explanation came out in a bit of a rush. He said he was just checking on Lydia because he'd heard she was feeling under the weather, and he'd brought her this plant to help brighten up her space. He said he wouldn't stay long, just wanted to drop it off and make sure she was doing okay. Here's the thing that I picked up immediately. Lydia hadn't mentioned being sick. Not to me. We'd spent Friday evening together, and she'd seemed perfectly fine. If she were sick, I was apparently the last to know. I told him thanks for thinking of her, but she was actually feeling much better today. I could see him trying to figure out how to handle the situation. He kept glancing past me into the apartment, probably wondering if he should ask to come in or just hand over the plant and leave. He chose to leave. Smart choice. I watched him walk down the hallway toward the elevator, and that's when it really sank in. Danny knew exactly where Lydia lived. He knew which floor, which apartment number. He'd walked up those stairs like he'd done it before. The way he'd approached the door, the confidence with which he'd knocked. This wasn't his first time here. When I got back inside, Lydia was coming out of the bathroom, running her hands through her hair and asking who had been at the door. I told her it was Danny. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask what he was doing there or how he'd found her apartment. She just nodded and asked what he wanted. That's when I asked her the question that had been building in my mind since I'd opened that door. Since when has Danny been visiting you at home? She gave me that same dismissive laugh I'd been hearing for months whenever Danny's name came up in our conversations. She said it wasn't that serious, like I was making a big deal out of nothing. But I was done with that laugh. I was done with having my concerns minimized and brushed off like I was some insecure guy who didn't understand how friendships worked. This had gone beyond casual friendship the moment Danny started showing up at her apartment unannounced. I looked at Lydia standing there. I looked at the potted plant Danny had left on her kitchen counter. I thought about all the times over the past few months when I tried to express my discomfort with their friendship, only to be told I was overthinking things. I made a decision that would change everything. I told her she needed to call Danny right now and tell him to never visit her apartment again. More than that, she needed to end whatever relationship they had beyond casual hellos at the gym. I wasn't asking anymore. I was telling her. She smiled at me like I was being dramatic. She said he was just a friend, using that same tone she'd used dozens of times before. But I wasn't backing down this time. I looked at the digital clock on her microwave. It read 2:47 p.m., and I told her she had exactly 5 minutes to make that call. If she didn't, she wouldn't see me again. I meant it, and something in my voice must have conveyed that, because her smile faltered for just a second. But then she shook her head and sat down on the couch, like she was calling my bluff. She thought I was bluffing. After months of bringing up Danny, months of dismissing my concerns, months of treating our relationship like it was flexible enough to accommodate whatever friendship she wanted to maintain, she thought this was just another conversation she could laugh her way out of. I watched that clock change from 2:47 to 2:48, then to 2:49. Lydia stayed on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. At 2:50, I started putting on my jacket. At 2:51, she looked up from her phone with a confused expression, asking if I was really going somewhere. At 2:52, exactly 5 minutes after I'd given her the ultimatum, I picked up my keys from her kitchen counter and headed for the door. That's when Lydia realized I was serious. She jumped up from the couch and followed me to the door, then out into the hallway. Her voice was getting louder, more desperate. She asked if I was really going to leave over this. She asked if I was really that insecure. I didn't answer. I kept walking down those 3 flights of stairs while Lydia's voice echoed in the stairwell behind me. By the time I reached the ground floor, she'd stopped following, but I could still hear her voice carrying down from above. I got in my car and drove back to my apartment, processing what had just happened. I'd given Lydia a clear boundary, a simple choice, and she'd chosen to ignore it. She'd chosen to treat my concerns as unreasonable even when presented with an ultimatum. That evening, around 7:30, I got my first text from her. She asked if we could talk about what had happened. I read it, considered responding, and then decided against it. I'd already said everything I needed to say. The silence stretched on for days. No calls, no texts after that first one. I went on with my days. By the end of that first week, I realized something important. Lydia wasn't fighting for our relationship. She wasn't calling to apologize or to discuss what had happened. Neither of us had contacted the other for over a week. That's when I made the decision to make our breakup official. The following Monday, exactly 8 days after I'd walked out of Lydia's apartment, I started canceling our shared commitments. I updated my relationship status on social media and let my family know that Lydia and I were no longer together. My sister Vanessa's reaction was supportive but not surprised. She'd met Lydia a few times and liked her, but she'd also heard me complain about the Danny situation more than once. She said she was proud of me for standing up for myself and not settling for a relationship where my feelings weren't respected. That same evening, I got a text from Lydia. She asked if I had really ended our relationship over her friendship with Danny. The tone was incredulous, like she couldn't believe I'd actually followed through on what I'd said. I didn't respond. I'd already made my position clear, and there was nothing left to discuss. Over the next few days, the messages started coming more frequently. At first, they were angry. Lydia called the whole thing ridiculous and said we could work it out if I'd just be reasonable. She said I was throwing away what we had for nothing. Then the messages shifted to bargaining. She said she'd be willing to talk to Danny less if that would make me happy. She said maybe they could just be gym acquaintances instead of friends. She asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss a compromise. I still didn't respond. The time for compromise had been months ago, when I'd first expressed my discomfort with their friendship. The time for change had been that Saturday afternoon, when I'd given her 5 minutes to make a choice. By the third week, Lydia's messages had become desperate. She admitted that maybe she'd been wrong to dismiss my concerns. She said she would end her friendship with Danny completely if that's what it took. She begged me to reconsider, saying she'd realized how much I meant to her and that she was willing to do whatever it took to fix things. But it was too late. The issue had never really been about Danny specifically. It had been about respect, about having my feelings taken seriously, about being in a relationship with someone who cared enough about my comfort to make adjustments when I expressed legitimate concerns. Lydia had shown me, over and over again, that my feelings were less important to her than her friendship with another man. She'd shown me that she viewed my boundaries as negotiable, my concerns as unreasonable, and my discomfort as something to be laughed off rather than addressed. The final message came almost a month after our breakup. Lydia said she understood now why I'd been upset, and that she was sorry for not taking my feelings seriously. She said she'd learned a lot about herself and about relationships, and that she hoped maybe we could start over. I read that message, considered it for about 30 seconds, and then deleted it without responding. Looking back now, I realized that the afternoon Danny showed up at Lydia's apartment was actually a gift. It forced a situation that revealed exactly where I stood in Lydia's priorities, and it gave me the clarity I needed to make a decision I should have made months earlier. I learned that boundaries aren't suggestions. I learned that when someone consistently dismisses your concerns, they're telling you something important about how they view you and your relationship. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from someone who doesn't value what you bring to their life. Most importantly, I learned that I was capable of following through on my words, even when it was difficult. When I told Lydia she had 5 minutes to make a choice, I meant it. When I said she wouldn't see me again if she didn't make that call, I meant that too. Some people might say I was being dramatic or controlling. Some might argue that I should have been more understanding about her friendship with Danny. But I know what I experienced, and I know what I was willing to accept in a relationship. I proved to Lydia that my words had meaning, that my boundaries were real, and that I valued myself enough to walk away from a situation that wasn't working. I proved to myself that I could make difficult decisions and stick with them, even when the person I loved was begging me to change my mind. 6 months later, I have opened myself up to new people, but still, I sometimes wonder how things might have been different if Lydia had just made that phone call that Saturday afternoon. If she'd chosen to respect my feelings over her friendship with Danny. If she'd realized that relationships require compromise, and that sometimes you have to make sacrifices for the person you love. But then I remember how it felt to have my concerns laughed off for months, how it felt to watch her prioritize another man's feelings over mine, how it felt to be made to feel unreasonable for wanting basic respect in my relationship. I don't wonder about those things for very long. The truth is, Lydia showed me exactly who she was and what I could expect from a future with her. She showed me that she viewed my discomfort as less important than her social life, my boundaries as less significant than her friendships, and my feelings as something she could dismiss whenever they became inconvenient. I'm grateful that I learned these things about her before we got married, before we bought a house together, before we had kids. I'm grateful that Danny showed up at her apartment that afternoon, because it forced a conversation that needed to happen. Most of all, I'm grateful that I found the strength to walk away from someone who didn't value what I brought to the relationship. It was the hardest decision I'd made in years, but it was also the right one. Sometimes love means fighting for someone, but sometimes it means recognizing when someone isn't fighting for you and having enough self-respect to stop fighting for them too. That Saturday afternoon, I told Lydia to end her friendship with another man. She laughed it off, just like she'd done dozens of times before. But that night, I proved her wrong. I proved that my words had meaning, that my boundaries were real, and that I valued myself enough to walk away from a relationship that wasn't serving me. It took exactly 5 minutes to change my life. 5 minutes to go from someone who accepted being dismissed to someone who demanded respect. 5 minutes to prove that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply mean what you say.